So today I would like to consider how kindness is a big part of witnessing. Sometimes kindness doesn't matter unless it's to us. And so we don't think it's that as important. But I'm looking at the story of David and Jonathan today to get a setting here. When David was just a singer in the household of Saul, and Jonathan was the apparent heir to the throne of Israel, the two men formed a very strong friendship, as you remember. So insightful was Jonathan that he knew David would be the next king. And he was not jealous. Not one bit was he jealous, because he knew that God picked David instead of him. It was quite the opposite. So if you turn your Bible to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel. Boy, I turned right to 1 Samuel 18. We'll pick up the story there. 1 Samuel 18. First Samuel 18, verse 1. I'll read 4 verses here. 1 Samuel 18, 1 to 4. And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, I think it was David, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. 2. And Saul took him that day, and would let him go no more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him, and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. Jonathan loved David, but his father Saul did not. Remember, King Saul. Verse 5. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war. And he was accepted in the sight of all people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. 6. And it came to pass, as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And when the women answered one another, they answered as they played, and said, Saul has slain his thousands. Oh, that's real good. Oh, that made Saul. But then, and David his 10,000. Oh. And Saul, verse 8, and Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? Verse 9, and Saul eyed David from that day and forward. Look, verse 10. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit of God came upon Saul. Now we need to stop right there. What in the world does that mean? The verse 10, and it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul. Now the first superficial, shallow reading of that doesn't sound good, does it? But what's happening here is the Bible a few times, and we'll run into it one more time, it ascribes what God does not prevent as God being responsible for it. Because if you'll remember, the word Satan or devil is not even mentioned in the Bible until a long ways from now. Clear up into Chronicles. It's not even mentioned, because God evidently was trying to protect the people from Israel, thinking that there are two gods fighting each other, that there was a good God and a bad God. So the devil isn't even mentioned. The word devil isn't even mentioned in the Old Testament. But Satan is not even mentioned until you get almost to the book of Job, because God did not want the people to think that there was two gods struggling with each other and one was a little stronger than the other. Not at all. We do find the serpent, in the first few verses of Genesis, but Satan is not mentioned, because God did not want them to think, like I mentioned, of two gods. And so that's why that's there. Okay, that was 10. Let me start 10 over. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand, as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul, verse 11, Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. So here Saul begins to go on the warpath against David, and he's angry and jealous of him. So now let's turn to chapter 19, And I'll read the first 3 verses here of 1 Samuel 19. And Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, saying, Saul my father seeketh to kill thee. Now therefore, I pray thee, take heed to thyself until the morning, and abide in a secret place, and hide thyself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where thou art, and I will commune with my father of thee, and what I see, that I will tell thee. And then we go down to verse 9. This is a long story, so I'm having to just do the highlights of it, because we're going somewhere with this. Okay, verse 9. And there's we run into that again. And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul. No, the devil was upon Saul, but God did not restrain it, because Saul had rejected the Lord. And so the Lord has withdrawn his spirit from Saul, so Saul does not have the protection from against Satan. So Satan has come upon Saul because Saul has allowed it. And so verse 9 again, the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul, as he sat in his house with his javelin in his hand, and David played with his hand. And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Verse 11, and Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, David's wife told him, saying, if thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed, and put a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster, and covered it with the cloth. Well, anyway, let's verse 16. And when the messengers were come in, behold, there was an image in the bed with a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster. So anyway, they're trying to kill David at home, wherever they can find him. So Saul has gone insane. And that takes us to chapter 20, verse 11. 1 Samuel 20, verse 11. And Jonathan said unto David, come and let us go out into the field. And they went out, both of them, into the field. And Jonathan said unto David, O Lord God of Israel, when I have sounded my father about tomorrow any time, or the third day, and behold, if there be good toward David, and I then sin not unto thee, and show it thee. Verse 13, and the Lord do so, and much more to Jonathan. But if it please my father to do thee evil, then I will show it thee, and send thee away, that thou mayest go in peace, and the Lord be with thee as he hath been with my father. So anyway, so Jonathan is a friend of David, helping David to save his own life and to keep Saul from killing him. And so their souls have been knit together. Let me see if I want to read down to 17. Okay, verse 16. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord even require it at the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan caused David to swear again, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. So when Saul is trying to kill David, it was Jonathan who spared David's life now. And when David and Jonathan were conspiring a plan to save David's life, Jonathan in return asked that David not only show the kindness of the Lord to him, but also to his house forever, for his progeny. And David kept that promise. David's friendship with Jonathan outlasted their life. Now that comes to verse 30. Verse 30, here we are. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said unto him, thou son of the perverse rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion, and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse liveth on the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. And Jonathan answered Saul his father, and said unto him, wherefore shall he be slain? What hath he done? Verse 33, and Saul cast a javelin at Jonathan, his son, to smite him, whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined of his father to slay David. So when Saul was so crazy that he was trying to kill his own son. Can you believe that? I mean, your own flesh and blood. So now we go to chapter 22 of 1 Samuel, verse 6, 22, verse 6. Well, I'm going to skip all that because there's something in here I think I want to say. Okay, 1 Samuel 22, verse 6. When Saul heard that David was discovered and the men that were with him, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. Then Saul said unto his servants that stood about him, Hear now, ye Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of men? So he's saying here, David can't do anything for you. Let's kill him. But what about me? I can do all this for you. So you better be on my side. Verse 13, and Saul said unto him, Why have ye conspired against thee, thou and the son of Jesse, in that thou hast given him bread and a sword, and hast inquired of God for him? And he should arise against me to lie in wait as this day. Verse 17, and the king said unto the footmen that stood about him, Turn and slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled, and did not show it to me. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. Verse 18, and the king said to Doeg, Doeg, Turn now and fall upon the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned and fell upon the priests, and slew on that day 80 or 85 persons that did wear a linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priests, he smote with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and sucklings and oxen and asses and sheep with the edge of the sword. I mean, Saul has gone completely crazy and has become devil-possessed. A lot has happened between the days of his friendship between David and Jonathan. Then David was just a singer on the run from the madman king of Israel. So let's move forward to when David is the king of Judah. Saul is dead. David has become king. And David's good friend Jonathan, son of King Saul, is also dead. Remember, he died in a battle where Saul got wounded. How David's heart must have pained by that. David was anointed as king of Judah, but Ishbosheth, another one of Saul's sons, made himself king over Israel, the 10 tribes of the north. So 2 Samuel 2 talks about that. So David has a rival. And there was a long war between David and Ishbosheth. There was a long war between them, and that's talked about in 2 Samuel 3:1. Let me read that, just one little verse here. 2 Samuel 3:1. Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. But during that wartime, David became stronger. So that takes us to 2 Samuel 5. And we're going somewhere with this, so it won't be just boring history. But you know what's nice about history when you're an adult? You don't have to be tested on it. I love it. I like history a lot better now than I did when I was in school. How about you? Yeah, you don't have to pass the test. Remember all those dates they put on you? All the dates and names, and just went on and on and on. So 2 Samuel 5, we come to 2 Samuel 5, verse 1. Then came all the tribes of Israel to David unto Hebron, and spake, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. Also in time past, when Saul was king over us, thou wast he that led us out and brought us in Israel. I mean, he was the king, head of the army for King Saul. And the Lord said to thee, Thou shalt feed my people Israel, and thou shalt be a captain over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron, and King David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. So finally, as David is proclaimed king over both Israel and Judah. He conquered Jerusalem. He made it his capital city, and the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Jerusalem. So God made his covenant with David, and David added a lot to the fringe territory of his kingdom. That was a pretty busy time for David. So what I want to consider next is a beautiful thing. David remembers his promise to Jonathan 22 years later. 22 years ago he made that. And David keeps his promise to Jonathan. And that takes us to 2 Samuel 9. I want us to notice some things about David. Somebody has said, and this I think is a good saying, good advice that we can get from God's word is, do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, in all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you can. That's good advice. Now, as you look at David, you're going to see a man who knows how to be kind. David was so benevolent, he had a good heart. It was said about David that he would hold an umbrella over a duck in a rainstorm. He was so kind. And so he was just that kind of a fellow. Now it is time for him to live up to his promise. He said to his friend Jonathan, I will be kind to your family forever. And that even continues down to us today to help us because we have the record of it here. Now remember, being kind to the family of Jonathan meant that you were also kind to the family of Saul, even though he was trying to kill him, because Jonathan was a son of Saul. Now let's look at the story, 2 Samuel 9. 2 Samuel 9, verse 1. 2 Samuel 9:1. And David said, is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And there was of the house of Saul a servant whose name was Ziba. And when they had called him unto David, the king said unto him, thou art Ziba. And he said, thy servant is he. Verse 3, and the king said, is there not any of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God unto him? And Ziba said unto the king, Jonathan hath yet a son, which is lame on his feet. Remember that? Who remembers his name? What is it? Yes. It's a tricky name. We don't hear that name very often anymore. Verse 4, and the king said unto him, where is he? And Ziba said unto the king, behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amaliel, or in Lobadar. Verse 5, then King David sent and fetched him out of the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, from Lodabar. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come unto David, he fell on his face, did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, behold thy servant. You know, this would be scary. It would be very scary because there would be enemies. And so Mephibosheth would be frightened that he was going to be killed, because you kill off all your enemies, don't you? Kill off all the families. They were wicked. So anyway, there's several S's in this beautiful story. David searches out for the son of Jonathan. So that's the only time a fib is okay, is when it's in the middle of your name. Mephibosheth. Otherwise, it's not. What a name. Can you imagine having a name of a little boy, Mephibosheth? Here, little Mephibosheth. Here, you're so cute, Mephibosheth. I can think of shorter ones, can't you? Shorter names. What a name this boy has. He's not living in the capital. He's not living in the country nearby. He is separated from the king. And notice what it is that separates this man Mephibosheth from King David. We learned in verse 3 that he was lame upon his feet. When he was a little boy, his nurse dropped him, fleeing from him, and probably smashed his legs. He could not walk well. Broken bones did not get set properly, I'm sure. He was separated by his circumstances, and the accident was not his fault. It was caused by someone else. And that's our story, isn't it? We'll get there. David had been a young warrior king and now a middle-aged warrior king. David was a strong, athletic kind of fellow, but the man Mephibosheth was not. He was separated by circumstances from King David. He was also separated by birth from King David. Remember, this is the grandson of a former monarch, the arch enemy of David. There's absolutely no reason except for the grace of God for David to be this kind to him. And notice also he was separated by distance. David was living in Jerusalem, the capital of his empire, living in luxury in his palace. Mephibosheth was living in a place called Lodabar. Lodabar means no pasture. So he was living in poverty. It's the east of Jordan, so it's outside the country of Israel. He's living in a distant place where there's no pasture, not the best of things going on in his life. And verse 4 tells us that he was separated from the king. Verse 5 that indicates that Mephibosheth was summoned by the king. He's asked to come to the kingdom. He has no idea why, but I'm sure he was fearful. New rulers killed all the rival family members off. It says that the king sought Mephibosheth. David went out to find him. He sent for Mephibosheth. So the king sought Mephibosheth, and the king brought Mephibosheth. He not only sent after him, he fetched him out of the house of Machir. He brought him to the capital city because he wanted him to be in his presence, so he could show kindness to him. This is an incredible story of grace and kindness by the king. Mephibosheth was far from David, but David summoned him to come close. So 2 Samuel 9, verse 6. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come unto David, he fell on his face and did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth, and he answered, Behold thy servant. Verse 7, and David said unto him, Fear not. Don't you love that? God's people always say, don't be afraid. His angels always say, don't be afraid. Fear not. Satan will try to frighten you and scare you, and his demons will try to cause all kinds of trouble. But God's people always say, Fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. And it is David who summoned him, and now we see David sparing Mephibosheth's life. And where we're going with this is our story. This is what God has done to us. Mephibosheth arrives at the presence of King David, and that this is something he never anticipated would ever happen in his life. He was just a miserable nobody. Even though David and Jonathan were friends, there was war between Saul's line and David's line. They had been at war for years. Verse 8. And he bowed himself and said, What is thy servant that thou shouldest look unto such a dead dog as I am? Isn't that something to call yourself a dead dog? He fell on his face. He admitted his worthlessness. He called himself a dead dog. That's just a way of saying, I'm not even worthy of your consideration. If David had been a heathen king, Mephibosheth would have been a dead dog, literally. But the man who was separated from the king, summoned by the king, is now spared by the king. Now, even though he knew he was unworthy, when the king made a promise to him, Mephibosheth believed him. Verse 9. Then the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said unto him, I have given unto thy master's son all that pertain to Saul and to all his house. And look at the support that comes from the king. The man separated from the king, summoned by the king, spared by the king, is now supported by the king. Look at verse 10. Now therefore, and thy sons and thy servants shall till the land for him, and thou shalt bring in the fruits that thy master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, thy master's son, shall eat bread always at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then said Ziba unto the king, according to all that my lord the king hath commanded his servant, so shall thy servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table as one of the king's sons. He's made a son of the king. Verse 12, and Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all that dwelled in the house of Ziba were servants unto Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he did eat continually at the king's table and was lame on both his feet. This is a tender story. The story begins with Mephibosheth being at a distance and can be separated from the king. And yet the king called him to come to him. Called him to come to the capital. Called him to come to his own throne room. He was summoned by the king. Isn't that our story? Then the plan was to reveal that David was going to make certain promises to Mephibosheth, and he would spare his life. Instead of killing him, the grandson of Saul, he would provide him and would support him all the days of his life. What a heritage. Ziba, the servant of all his sons and servants, would till the fields and provide for Mephibosheth. While they would do that for the house of this lame man, the grandson king of Saul, this son of Jonathan would sit at the table of the king forever. Not only had Mephibosheth's future been provided for, he ate at the king's table. And Mephibosheth enjoyed the fine white linen at the king's table. And what does that mean? It means that you and I, whatever we can do, to be kind as often as we can. Because kindness is a mark of one who wants to please God. So we should be kind, shouldn't we? Kindness is a witness of the walk with God. Someone has said, speak your kind words soon, for you never know how soon it will be too late. King David wanted to do something for Mephibosheth very soon, because he knew how long who knew how long David would live or Mephibosheth would live. Kindness is a language that the dumb can speak. It's a language the deaf can hear. It's a language the blind can see. And here is Mephibosheth. Notice the last words of chapter 9. He was lame on both his feet. It was the fine linen of the king that covered his lameness, so that no one would even know that he was lame when they're eating at the king's table. The linen would cover his feet. Separated, summoned, spared, supported, and his shame was covered. Wow. He looked and lived like the king of the sun. I love this story. And why is it important? Because it's our story, isn't it? It's our story, what God has done for us. We are Mephibosheths. Are you a Mephibosheth? If you don't feel crippled, just wait a few years. We'll be crippled, won't we? Some of us, it won't take that long. We'll get there soon enough. Because you see, what King David did for Mephibosheth, King Jesus did for us. We were born crippled by sin. We were dropped by Adam's sin and Eve's sin. We were separated from God, living in a world full of sin, all by ourselves. And we are drawn by the Spirit of God, summoned by the King to come to him by faith. We are invited to taste, to see that he is good. Today we sit as lame people, as blind people, as dumb people, as we sit at the table of the King Jesus. And while we are still blind and lame and unable to speak, all of my infirmities are covered by the fine linen of his robe. So what King David did for Mephibosheth, King Jesus did for us. That is the great lesson of this story for all of us. The kindness that David showed to Mephibosheth, we should show to others too, shouldn't we? We should invite them to take part of us. We are to go and search for crippled people today, just like King David searched for Mephibosheth, people with smashed lives. Do we witness the good news? We should, shouldn't we? Because you can't get back to the King by yourself. You can't get back to Jesus by yourself. You have to be summoned to come to him. So Jesus says to you and me, come unto me, all you that labor and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. So you don't have to clean up your act before you come. He will help you do that. When it comes to you, he'll make everything right. Now, in closing, I want to look at some verses, because we're talking about promises here, that promise that David made to Jonathan and how he spared him. Because in closing, I want to look at some promises. I have a couple in the Old Testament and a couple in the New Testament. But the first one I want to look at is in Mark 13:31. I don't know if you think about this very often, but listen to this. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but Jesus says, my words shall not pass away. His words are eternal. This book is an eternal book. When we get to heaven, God is going to explain things to us. And I heard a guy say one time, God's even going to explain to us the blank spaces in between the words. And then I thought that was good, because that's why the Bible is so important. They are eternal words. Well, let me read a couple of promises in the Old Testament that you might even are familiar with. But let me read that to you. Isaiah, because we're talking about promises here. Isaiah 41:10. Isaiah 41:10. Make sure I'm on 41. Yeah, okay. Isaiah 41:10. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. That's a good promise, isn't it? I love that promise. There in Jeremiah 29:11, you probably remember that one. I love this one too. Two of them from the Old Testament. 29:11. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. Those are for God's followers, aren't they? Those are for us, promises that we can have. Now, two New Testament promises. Hebrews 10. Let me find Hebrews here. The last book that Paul wrote. Hebrews 10:23. Hebrews 10:23. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promises. Let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works. Forsake not the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as we see the day approaching. That applies to us, doesn't it? And then 2 Peter, the last one, 2 Peter, James and Peter. This verse astounds me. 2 Peter 1:4. Whereby are giving unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye may be partakers of the divine nature. To me, that is astounding. We can draw in the divine nature from the Word of God, whose word they're eternal. And so to me, this is astounding. Partakers of the divine nature. Oh, I just love that.